Hello everybody, welcome back. Last video, I started actually talking about the next topic, and I found out, apparently if you talk about this, your camera dies. But ran out of batteries, and mostly because this first one I'm going to talk about today, was kind of bad-mouthing it a little bit. I'm going to again in this video, that you're actually going to see. Hopefully, don't die on me, camera. Don't die. But, we're going to get to what I want to talk about in the last video. It's been a little while. Been very, very busy. A lot of work. So, finding spare time doing this has been a little bit challenging. I wanted to get through a lot more videos this far into October. I wanted to do, all this pre stuff and then actually get into vampire movies and get a good chunk into it, hopefully. At least as far as I have planned up to be done by the end of this month, but it looks like I might be going over time. So there's that. Okay, so want to get through this again. Don't die, camera. Don't die. Got brand new batteries, lithiums, so they should last. At least they should. That's the key word, should. So today's video is going to be on the story that comes next after Polydor's The Vampire, and that is Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood. That's all one title. Varney, it's a challenging story, and I'll get to why in a minute. And just full disclosure, it's a story I didn't finish. I gave a good honest shot, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this is the one of the stories that I'm talking to you guys about that I did not finish. So, just letting you know that off the bat. Varney is an interesting story. It's one that you may have never heard of, but its influence is still felt today in many respects. It's responsible for coming up with so many vampire motifs almost single-handedly. The only one that it doesn't come up with on its own is the idea of the aristocratic, highborn, fancy schmancy, powerful vampire. Polidori had beaten him to the punch in that regard, and you can see the influence of Polidori had on this story, but it just takes it further. Takes it to the next level in a lot of ways, because it's a long story, so it can expand on the ideas that were set forth in Polydor's story and add a whole bunch to it. There's three things that I want to talk about that Varney the Vampire is responsible for that is almost surprising in a lot of ways. The first one, anyway, that it hadn't been around. You get these stories that go back centuries, back to Revenants and so forth. And this one element is missing from all of it. And the thing that is started in Varney the Vampire, now you could argue it's hinted at in other stories, but it's not explicitly mentioned until this story, and that is the fangs. Varney the Vampire invented the vampire fangs. It's responsible for it. It popularized it, got it into public consciousness that vampires have fangs, and that they bite you on the neck, and they leave the two pinprick marks on the neck, and that's the telltale sign of a vampire. Comes from Varney the Vampire. I don't know. When I first read that myself, I started looking back through old stories, and I was shocked to find that was the case. So we have Varney to thank for that. The second thing. Now, this is something I've noticed in big movies, TV shows, and so forth. So it's a little thing, nothing major, but once I point it out to you, you'll find it a little more interesting. It's one of those little quirky things, I guess you could say, in vampire stories and TV shows, movies, that you notice, and sometimes if you watch enough of it, or if you watch something and then something else soon after that has this in it, you'll notice it, but you'll just kind of wonder in the back of your head, like, why is that a thing? Where does that come from? I know a lot of people, myself included, before I started getting into this, A lot of people believe that Dracula is the first vampire story, and that Dracula sets forth, where all the motifs, the mythos, all the themes, down to set design and stuff like that. You think castle with the stairwell, all that sort of stuff, and the cape, and just the look, all the little things that you just kind of think, well, that started with Dracula, so that's the explanation for it. But then there are things that, and this is why I wanted to do these videos, talking about some of these things. There are things in vampire stories that, they're not in Dracula. And if you never look back, you just kind of wonder, where do these things come from? And one of those things is proof in some form or another that the vampire, in the story, even before it's revealed to be a vampire, in some cases, in others not, but it's revealed that the vampire existed long before this point, when the story takes place. There's, a picture or an eyewitness account from somebody living that, they've seen that person before, somewhere, somewhen. The most famous, of course, being in the 1960s, there was the soap opera TV show Dark Shadows by Dan Curtis. And in it, you've got Jonathan Frid playing the famous Barnabas Collins. And, Barnabas comes into the Collinwood house, the Collins house, and there's a picture of Barnabas up on the wall from 100 years ago. Dressed slightly different, back when, not exactly, I'm not sure, I can't remember if he was alive at that time or if he was already the vampire. But it's still proof that he was around back then. They just sort of chalk it up to, that's like his great-grandfather or something, Isn't the resemblance amazing? But, it's him. It's the same person. Two of my favorites, actually three rather, think of it. There's one in the TV show Angel, which was the spin-off of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And there's a scene in, I think it's the first episode of season 2, where they get their new location, which is the Hyperion Hotel, and they're going through the history of the hotel. At least, I think it's the characters Cordelia and Wesley, maybe Gunn, but I think it's Wesley, and they're I know you got a lot of Buffy fans and Angel fans screaming at me that are watching this, going, "It was so and so," but it's been a little while since I've watched it. You're lucky I remember this at all. But anyway, they're going through pictures, and they find pictures from the 1950s, I believe, and they find a picture of Angel, in a crowd of people at the Hyperion, proof that he had been there. Of course, we already know he's a vampire. We know he's been around for a long time, from flashbacks and so on, but you actually get physical proof that, here he is existing long before anybody in the show knew him. And then two for eyewitness accounts. There's one in the film Near Dark, and it's towards the end of the movie where the vampires come in, and there's this old guy who's seen him, like maybe 20, maybe 30 years ago. He's just like, "I remember you," and the vampire's like, "Yeah, let's come through here every 20, 25 years, or whatever, how long it is," and just make some quick remark to the guy, and they leave. But probably my all-time favorite is from Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, where D buys a horse because he needs a horse, and D's the vampire, but he's half vampire, but so he can exist in daylight, and he's shopping around for a horse, and there's this old man, I mean really old, and the people come in, like the sheriff and so on. They just want to either arrest or kill him because he's part vampire. And the old man's just like, "No, he paid for the horse. He can take it and he can leave." And the sheriff and the old man get into an argument. And the old man, he's just like, "Shut up, I'm going to tell you a story." He tells the story about how, well, one time there was a vampire that kidnapped a bunch of kids. And the town pulled their money together, hired a vampire hunter to get the kids back. And the sheriff, this guy is like, in his 30s or 40s, and he's just like, yeah, I heard that story growing up, what about it? And the old man's like, I was one of those kids, and, this is the guy that saved me, so, F you, he's getting the horse and leaving. And, so there's stuff like that. You see it pop up every now and again, and I had no idea where it came from until I started reading Varney, and I was like, oh, that's where it comes from, because, there's this family of Bannersworths, and they've got this, painting of an ancestor theirs on the wall, and that painting is of Varney from like 100 years ago. It's basically, in a lot of ways, Varney the Vampire and the show I mentioned earlier, Dark Shadows, they're very, very similar to each other. Dark Shadows is almost like a retelling of Varney the Vampire. In a lot of its themes, it's just done a lot better, But, so there's two things. I just have to check my time, because I've been talking for a little while here, so I wanted to make sure that I still have time. I've got a half-hour time limit on this thing for the setting that I have it on. I could lower the setting and double the time, but the picture quality would be worse, so I don't want to do that. So I've got it just right where I can talk for a little while without it shutting off on me, but I still have to be conscious of the time. So the third thing that Varney is responsible for, and this is very important, because you've got the legends of vampires prior to this time. And this book was written in 1845, and so you got be up to 1845. The majority of vampire stories, with the possible exception of the Vikram and the Vampire story there, where the vampire is more mischievous, but all those tales of vampires, revenants, and so forth, they're these evil creatures. They'll kill you. They're soulless, just vicious killers if given half a chance. And in a lot of respects, Varney is in a lot of ways, he's the same way. But there's an extra element. There's something that gets added to the story as it goes on that is brand new, that has never been even thought of in any vampire stories. And because, back in the old days, anything kind of evil supernatural was the domain of the devil. As I mentioned in a previous video, the influence of the church on the ideas of such creatures. So you just had, good, evil. It was very black and white. So there were no redeeming qualities for a creature like a vampire until this story. And the thing that this story created is the idea of the sympathetic vampire. This is a trope that we've seen in many up to today. There's a lot of examples of it. Where the sympathetic vampire is the vampire who sees his immortality as a curse, sees it as something to atone for, that they've done something horribly wrong, that trading their immortal soul or whatever to become immortal in life just it was worth it for a time, and then it stopped being worth it. And the idea of eternity just it becomes overwhelming, and just the things that they've done to survive by being a vampire starts to weigh on them. Like this is the idea of a vampire with a consciousness. You could say a vampire with a soul, but they want to be good, but they just can't be good because of their nature. So you've got that dynamic of them fighting their own inner evil, trying to make amends, trying to be better, but ultimately they can't, or they can only succeed up to a certain point. And we see this in lots of stories up to today. It's probably the thing that, in vampire movies anyway, past the 70s, that kept the genre alive. You started seeing it in Anne Rice's books like Interview with the Vampire, with the character of Louis. And it continues on today. But that element, it keeps it alive and fresh, because you went through a long period there where the vampires were just, these monster creatures, again, no redeeming qualities. And then you got, more human vampires. But that whole idea and, theme started with Varney. Now, no, don't die, camera, don't die. I'm going to talk crap about Varney a little bit here. Varney is a very challenging story to read. It's not just the words that are used, it's how they're used. This is one of the stories that was known in England at the time as a Penny Dreadful series. It's not really meant to be read as a one long book. These were stories that were written chapter by chapter, because as I recall, there was a problem with literacy rates in England at the time, and they just wanted to get stories out there that would interest the public so that they would keep reading, just keep their interest. You've got tons of other popular Penny Dreadful series from that time, but Varney went on for like 5 years, and the thing was that the Penny Dreadfuls, because of the need to want to get the public to read, the people that were paying the people to write the stories, they paid them by the word. So this is an example of one of those stories where calling it verbose is almost an insult to the word verbose. This is somebody who is just taking all the rules of grammar possible to construct these long sentences or paragraphs or just these rambling chapters where not a whole lot is said, but there's a lot of words to go through, and it just gets so repetitive. I recall, and this is why I had to stop reading it. It was just giving me a headache. I recall one right off the bat, I think it was in the first chapter, where in one sentence, it's described how a woman screams 5 different ways, all in the same sentence. But it's basically just like saying she screamed, she screamed, she screamed, she screamed, she screamed, but just rewording it like she screamed. There was a yell from her. She shrieked in terror, and it just playing with the rules of grammar so that he can get away with all these different iterations of just saying that she screamed, but it's all in one sentence, and it just gets so old fast. And the thing that made me just give up was there was a chapter about the painting that I mentioned of Varney, where this guy's just sitting in his room looking at the painting, and he thinks it's been moved. And he's just like, has it been moved? Was the picture moved? Does it matter if it was fucking moved? And he thinks he hears a knock on the door. Oh, was there a knock on the door? Oh, was this painting moved? Did the person who knocked on the door move the painting? And it goes on that's it. That's the only thing, 2 things that are talked about for an entire chapter. And it's not like it's a short chapter because that's all that's happening. Like, just pick up any book off your bookshelf and just read, one chapter just at random. It's the average length of any of your regular chapter. But just imagine for all that time that you're reading it, that's the only thing that's said. So that was my break point. And I gave up after that, reading Varney. It's got a lot of ideas, but it is just tough to get through. And this was, like I said, something that came out like once a week or once a month for 5 years. So it is this gargantuanly long story. And, in my research on this, I came across a website by the name of VictorianGothic.org. Now, here's the funny part. My original video that I was doing on this, which, it got only to a certain point and stopped, so, I might just show a clip of that later, maybe not, but if I still even have it, I'm not sure if I deleted it or not. But I got to this point where I was about to read what they had to say on the story, and that's when my camera died. So, if it dies again, It's because it's sensitive to what I have to say, and it's a fan of Varney, and it hates me. So that's my explanation. So, VictorianGothic.org put it this way, quote, Varney the Vampire has been described as the worst book of the 19th century. Introduced in 1845, the completed serial consisted of over 600,000 words of tedious dialogue, aimless meandering storylines, maddening repetition, and enough kernels of genius to consistently inspire horror fiction into the present day. Bram Stoker, Anne Rice, Stephen King, Russell T. Davies, and Frederick William Murnau are just some of the writers and filmmakers who have been indebted to concepts originated in the pages of Varney, making it easily the most influential vampire story that nobody reads. Okay, so it's not just my biased opinion. They think the same way as I did. I mean, I laughed for about 5 minutes after I read that because I was just like, oh, thank God somebody else shares my opinion on this. But yeah, it's important in vampire history. And the story itself isn't bad. It's just the way it's written is not great. But there are, I've noticed there's a YouTube page. I'll link it down below because I can't think of it offhand and I forgot to write it down. But I got it saved on my computer so I can just put the link in the low bar. There's a YouTube page where they are making Varney the Vampire. It is really funny too because you've got it's in episodes, like the chapter, going chapter by chapter, but the chapter, some of them they're only like 2 minutes long. When it would take you like 10 minutes or a little more to read through the dialogue, but it's just like if you stripped out all the description and just showed it visually, there's not a whole lot there, and it just flies by, which made me laugh also. But I found it far more compelling. And you can see when you strip it down to its essentials and what's actually going on in the scenes, that it is actually a very good story. They're not finished. They got through their first series, which probably in about an hour's time that it took, got through what took me. I started listening to it on an audiobook, just try to get through it quicker. And I listened to it for about 6 hours, and I think in maybe 45 minutes to an hour, they get further into the story than I got in in 6 hours of listening to it. So it just shows you how, like I said, verbose it can be reading it, but visually, in a storytelling movie sense, or even as a miniseries or something, it's very good. And I think there should be a professional, Hollywood studio production of it, even if it's Netflix original series or something like that, or a Hulu original series. It would make for a very good story. It's just that reading it is challenging. So probably should stop here. My next video is going to be about the next important story for vampire literature. This next one won't take me very long, but it's going to be on J. Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 story Carmilla. So I'll see you back then. I'll see you when you come back then. Blech, words. See, Varney, just even talking about it, and how it's trouble with the language just screws up my language. So, yay! Okay, I'm done with this one. Goodbye.